Okay, so here we are in Chapter 4. Chapter 4 has the same characteristic or quality of Chapter 3, the argument on judging or the chapter on judging arguments, in that it's very straightforward and laid out very explicitly in terms of the concepts that it presents. If we were in a regular classroom, we would probably go through each of these line by line and have a very thorough discussion, but you having the ability to read through this and also the ability to post any questions on the Blackboard website about any of the concepts can do so, but rather than go through line by line, section by section, talk about the concepts involved, I'm going to jump right to the end of the Arguer's Toolkit, which kind of is a summation not only of what's in that chapter but also everything that we've done so far, which I think will be a very good prelude to you writing your first exam. Kind of wraps up this section of the book in a nice little package. So at the end of the chapter on the Arguer's Toolkit, which is basically a survey of all the abilities arguers have in terms of reasoning and evidence and inference, I talk about some characteristics of argument in general. So please keep these principles in mind. Some of them are redundant with things we've talked about already, or incorporate later concepts with earlier ideas and that are now more fully fleshed out. So I'll just read these verbatim. It's a bulleted list. Good argument and persuasive argument are not always the same thing. For example, in an earlier chapter, we talked about the differences between argument and persuasion. Because argument and persuasion are different, we must recognize that even bad arguments, fallacious or illogical ones, can persuade. So in this chapter, we talked about the characteristic of logical argument, how it involves inference, that there are methods of induction and deduction, that there are fallacies, which are mistakes in logic and inference that you can make, that there are different patterns of reasoning. For example, analogy is a pattern, that there are different logical operators and logic operates within the realm of argument. Again, this is the contrast between good and bad argument in terms of its formal characteristics as opposed to effective versus ineffective argument, which has more to do with situation, psychology, and effect. And again, it underlines what I said in an earlier chapter, that making good arguments and persuading are not necessarily connected logically and not necessarily the same thing. In the best of all possible worlds, for example, the world that Aristotle perceived when he originally wrote about argument and debate 2,500 years ago, the most logical argument would be the most persuasive argument. But to this point, we still have not demonstrated that those are necessarily connected. Argument, despite the reputation for the word, can be fun. As one learns more about argument, it will be more like sport, an exercise for rational and strategic faculties. The better one becomes at it, more intellectually satisfying it can be as an activity. I hope you watched the Dershowitz-Finkelstein debate. I've shown that now for several years to my argumentation class. Until I find something better to replace it, I will continue to show it because it always has an amazing reaction from my students. There's a lot of chuckles and kind of open mouths as they see these two very educated professors really get very, very nasty with each other. And I even put a question about this on the midterm, so you'll have more of a chance to explore that. But I think what's really interesting about that argument is it displays so many of the characteristics we've already discussed or been exposed to in the class. For example, there are questions about what evidence is and what counts as good evidence and what's a fair use of evidence and who's being accurate and who's playing by the rules and who's not playing by the rules and who is staying on the subject as opposed to raising ancillary issues. There's just so many levels of answering the question, what is an argument? How do you have an argument? What's a good argument? What's a fair argument? What are the rules of arguments? What counts as evidence in argument? What's good reasoning in argument? How is an argument judged? How is an argument moderated or adjudicated by the referee or the person there whose purpose is to preserve the fairness and the interaction of the activity? So I hope you enjoyed that as much as I do. It's pretty powerful. And if you want to read something really interesting, go on Wikipedia and look up the Finkelstein-Dershowitz controversy. There's an article about what transpired as a result of that debate that took place. It's a very interesting story. Okay, moving on. Argument has benefits to the individual, the community, society. As one learns more about argumentation, the more he or she will see its applicability to career, intellectual development, and civic engagement. And I think you know that having the blessing of living in a free society, that this cannot be questioned as a principle. Everyone argues, so it is not to be dreaded or avoided. Again, argumentative ability seems to be native to all people, and since it can be developed to the advantage of both the culture and the individual, it should be embraced by every student seeking to lead a fulfilling life. One of the things I say at the beginning of this chapter is that everybody has this whole built-in set of abilities that are argumentative. We question, we are skeptical, we probe, we doubt, we investigate, we see the mistakes. And these are part of our argument set. We are by nature people who are curious, and we are not gullible by necessity. We can always question our beliefs in any realm. So I think that's part and parcel of what this principle is all about. We rarely understand completely the reasons why our arguments succeed or fail. Ironically, even as we study argument, it remains somewhat of a mystery why we are persuaded by arguments. The application of sound principles argument studies might reveal little to us about the psychology of how we are persuaded. Again, this is an expansion on the idea that argument and persuasion are a different thing. You could make the best argument and lose. You could make the worst argument and win. So succeeding and failing are different from good or bad arguments. There have been, in the 20th century, some very brilliant philosophers and theoreticians who have tried to argue that it would be nice to collapse the definitions of good and bad arguments with effective and ineffective arguments, and to get rid of that baggage which comes from philosophy and a whole history of comparing reason to unreason or logic to illogic, and say that no, there is a common theory of argument in which an effective argument and a good argument can be fused into a single concept. It's very utilitarian and consequentialist in its notion, but it's still a defensible idea and something worth pursuing, and I'll talk about it a little bit later on when we get into some other topics. Argument is often ritual, but rituals are good, especially in the culture of an organization. If one succeeds in an organization, it may be through the recognition of the ritual use of argument, with argument as part of institutional or corporate culture. So I just recently watched the movie Wolf of Wall Street. I don't know if any of you have seen that. By the way, I thought it was okay, not great. It did knock me out. But I thought there was a really interesting interaction which is replayed at some point in the movie. This isn't giving away anything if you haven't seen it. But there's a scene where a stockbroker hands to another new stockbroker who's just learning a pen and says to him, "Sell me this pen." So he's trying to get across the idea that that anything can be sold. Any idea can be sold, any product can be sold, that a good salesman can sell anything. You've probably heard that expression. Okay. So that's basically what's being talked about here, is that we have ritual beliefs about communication and about the effectiveness of our ability to argue, that people can be very persuasive, right? That you can talk somebody into doing something. You'll find throughout your life and career that people will want you to, quote, make the argument for that. And sometimes it's not that they need to be convinced, it's they need to see you go through the process of a ritual of making your case. Next, a bias in an argument as an ally. We are often taught to mistrust biases, to unearth or uncover people's bias in arguments, but actually a bias can be really good. You can be passionate about your subject because you have a bias. There's nothing wrong with feeling your argument. It may not help you argue better, but it can increase your motivation to argue successfully. It may help you look for better evidence, for example. Next, one can win an argument without stating a word. Remembering that argument is oppositional, the opponent's position may undo itself. Hanging back and waiting for an opponent's argumentative self-destruction is often sagacious strategy, and the word sagacious means wise. So what's an example of this? For years I've been in the faculty senate at NKU. I'm currently serving as the president. There are a few people in the faculty senate who will argue things to death. In other words, no matter what's brought up, they will present the objection. You can see that virtually everyone in the room is going to vote for something, but somebody is going to argue the opposite viewpoint or the contrary viewpoint. So it's kind of funny as you hear these contrary viewpoints espoused, you wouldn't imagine that somebody from the rest of the group, this overwhelmingly silent majority, is going to actually answer those objections because they think that those objections are ludicrous enough that not saying anything actually proves the point that the thing ought to be supported. If I actually start arguing against ludicrous arguments, I give them more credibility and actually enhance them. Argument is useful. Its utility crops up every day. There's a huge variety of situations in which making an argument can improve an outcome in one's daily life. I don't think I even need to elaborate upon that. Sometimes argument isn't necessary. One must always appraise a situation for appropriateness, relevance, even necessity. Sometimes things are better unstated. That's kind of like the hanging back idea that's up 2 bullet points, but there's actually a larger concept here, and that is that think about your whole life, your whole career, and all the situations you're in. Sometimes you just have to say, I'm not going to argue that point because there's something bigger down the road that I need to argue. And if I'm objecting all the way along, people are going to say, oh, that person's just an opinion monger, or they're argumentative, or they're raising nothing but objections. So hold back the small stuff and wait for the big stuff, I guess, is the good way to express that. But sometimes you don't even have to say anything and your argument will carry the day. Argument is essential to our system of government. Following politics makes us aware that the democratic governmental process cannot proceed in the absence of a system of argument. So that's all really politics is. It's arguments with a lot of money and power behind them. The rules under which argument proceeds are as important as the arguments themselves. Whenever one argues, he or she must know the rules, the protocols, the procedures, the decorum. This is so important. I hate to see people fail in their arguments because they don't understand that it's a rule-based activity, and every context and situation you walk into to make an argument, there are things that govern the way you're supposed to argue. So the moral of that story is always prepare, always be ready, always know the situation. If you were an attorney and you walked into court and you didn't know the rules of procedure for that jurisdiction or that court, you would be dead walking in the door as an advocate. Finally, argument is not just opinion. I already talked about that. In fact, it's the furthest thing from that. Argument is informed, substantiated, and supported. To make an argument is not to express opinion. It is to justify opinion in the most rigorous way the circumstances allow. Okay, now there's a whole bunch of tactics that you could develop as a result of this, and I just encourage you to read through these. These are based on the Arguer's Toolkit that I already talked about in this chapter, and rather than read these aloud, you can read them to yourselves and digest them. And again, if you have any questions, simply post them on the Blackboard website for the course. And in a moment, I'm just going to record another little audio, which I'll also place on Blackboard, which will talk a little bit about how to approach the exam. Thanks for listening.